Historical video games have always had a lot of controversy surrounding them, whether they should portray as accurately as possible or whether they can take as many creative liberties as they really want, and it's always been that question. Should historical accuracy be the main focus of a game, or if that's not their intention, can they stray away from it really as much as they want? Well, Wired thought that they were suitable to answer this question, and they recently released an article called Historical Video Games Have Promise, but only if they're honest. Pretty good bar there from them. They should put that in a diss track. Games rooted in Greek myth and 13th century Japan can be beneficial for educators, but are games illuminating the narrative or distorting it? And I think this is a pretty interesting question, and it's something that I've discussed on this channel many times. But as I was reading through this article, it started off pretty well, but then it got worse and worse until it was pretty much the same thing we've seen over and over again from these kind of journalists. The article starts by using the basis of Assassin's Creed's new Discovery Tour. This is Viking Age being a free add-on for Assassin's Creed Valhalla. If anyone doesn't know, Ubisoft have been adding in these Discovery Tours with their latest games, an almost free addition to walk you through what the life would have been like at the time. It doesn't have any of the conflict or the same gameplay mechanics as the Assassin's Creed games, but it does give you some education and some background to the periods that are being discovered. Now, of course, this was done through Assassin's Creed Origins within Egypt. We also got this within Greece as well in Odyssey, and now we've got Viking Britain in Valhalla. The aim is to introduce this Discovery Tour to 52 schools across the UK. The article then goes to talk on a bit about the background of educational video games, most notably bringing up the Oregon Trail that was created in 1971. If anyone doesn't know, this was a small educational computer game series that was developed by a teacher and a few colleagues to try and teach some stuff about the American West to their students. You can actually find and play the game online as well. Now, of course, it was made in the 1970s, so it's very basic, but I still feel like this is the best way to learn, especially when it comes to history. But as this article uses Assassin's Creed Valhalla as the example, Ubisoft's Discovery Tour, a free DLC and update specifically made for education that they've already stated that the game developer wants to introduce to 52 schools across the UK, it then starts to lose me a little bit. There is room in gaming for narratives that don't fit the sanitized conservative history taught in Western classrooms. I kind of understand that. You're able to push the boat out a little bit more, pardon the pun, when it comes to being able to teach people the horrors behind history, stuff that should be taught, and games give the creative ability for people to do that. However, this doesn't mean that games always get it right. This is an issue we see frequently in history-driven games, an industry dominated by white men in 2021. It goes on to show some sources about how 75% of developers are globally identified as male and 73% are white. I mean, I can completely agree that that's probably legit. However, that's not really what we're talking about here. Narratives are overwhelmingly viewed through a highly specific lens. Then it brings in the bit that loses me. It goes to talk about Ghost of Tsushima, the beautiful Japanese-inspired game that got such high reviews and should be coming out on PC this year. That game had next-level graphics. It was one of the most immersive experiences, and it was so highly rated because of it. People loved it. But it talks about this game, saying that it was not made from the perspective of Japanese culture and history, but the films of Akira Kurosawa. To give some background and context, Akira Kurosawa was a very famous Japanese filmmaker. In fact, he was one of the biggest of all time. He directed 30 films in a career spanning over 5 decades. Massive films like The Seven Samurai, Ikaru. He even was named Asian of the Century. This guy was a big deal. He was one of the founding fathers when it comes to Japanese movies, especially around the samurai, and that was something that Ghost of Tsushima really wanted to take and bring to their game. Overall, Wired talks about how Ghost of Tsushima has a narrative that is less of a glimpse into history than a Western interpretation of decades-old Japanese films. I don't quite understand the point here. Their point is that Ghost of Tsushima is not based solely in history, but is taking inspiration from Japanese films. These Japanese films, such as The Seven Samurai, for example, written and directed by one of the most famous Japanese filmmakers of all time, whose legacy was trying to bring Japanese culture to a wider Western audience, which he accomplished. The article talks about the industry is dominated by white men and creating games for a perceived white audience, saying that we'll continue to see these narratives, adapting through the lens of white sympathy rather than complicated reality, which is mind-blowing to me. Ghost of Tsushima is not meant to be an educational game. I do not know why it's being compared to one. I don't know why it's being held to a standard that it should have the ability to be taken into a classroom and to be taught to millions of kids. The story of Ghost of Tsushima is about the Mongol invasion. Of course, it's going to focus on certain parts and giving sympathy to your main character. That's nothing to do with an agenda of the developers. That is solely just how story writing goes. You want people to be attached to the main character. You need people to feel sympathy for them. So therefore, the story is told through their eyes. Of course, it's not going to be looking into the complex relationships between the invading Mongols, the samurai, and the people around at the time. That's not the intention of the game. It's to tell a story set in a beautiful world of feudal Japan. I completely agree that games can be great educators, sometimes better than anything else. And Ubisoft's Discovery Tour is brilliant for that. But it was made for that. As I mentioned, they're trying to compare a game that was made for educational purposes and saying that another game, in this case Ghost of Tsushima, should live up to that standard educationally. I mean, I don't really understand this argument in the first place. For example, it's the equivalent of comparing this book, a fantastic book, SPQR by Mary Beard, if anyone hasn't read it. It's about pretty much the full history of Rome. It's a great book. But it's like comparing that to Eagle's Prey by Simon Scarrow, a fictional Roman book, both set in a similar era, talking about similar things, but this is a fictional book. Its aim was to entertain and to tell the narrative of Cato and Macro. This book is to educate, and you can't hold both books up to the same standard because that's not their intention. There shouldn't be this comparison between two things that have absolutely nothing to do with each other apart from the setting that they are put in. It's this weird double standard that people have with historical games, where if it's something set in modern day, for example, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 isn't often said that it should be the beacon of educational knowledge of modern day, but as soon as a game is put in history, everyone always goes straight to, it should be educational just because it's set in history. There's so many rich narratives and things to explore within history that shouldn't always be tied to, this has to be historically accurate all the time. Does it help? Do people like it? Of course they do. But in terms of being used for education, sometimes it will hold a game back from being truly great. I mean, that is why, after all, Ubisoft released Discovery as a separate expansion. That's that educational expansion. The full game of Assassin's Creed Valhalla isn't an educational game. It is not historically accurate at all, because it was never meant to be. That's why they've separated the two. And I don't know why this Wired article has not worked that out. You can't have it both ways. You see, the problem is, when games try not to be historically accurate, they try and tell a story. Okay, Ghost of Tsushima is pretty good. They did some decent amount of historical research on that game, but it's not perfect. But it's not trying to be a historically accurate educational piece. It's trying to be a brilliant game, which it did well. But then when a game does try to be historically accurate, it gets absolutely slated. I mean, remember Kingdom Come Deliverance when it came out in 2018, that open world first-person medieval game? That was brilliant, but it was trying to be incredibly realistic and authentic to the time. And of course, at the time, publications and websites accused the developers of whitewashing for not including a notable amount of people of color within the game in 15th century Europe. Now, of course, people came out and developers and the historians came out saying, well, yeah, we're trying to make the game historically accurate here. They wanted to focus on realism, and people of colour did not inhabit early 15th century Bohemia in significant numbers. Did they exist? Of course they did, through traders, immigration, and all that kind of thing. But that wasn't the focus on the game. And to call a game whitewashing because it was trying to be historically accurate to the time is hypocritical, especially when a game tries to do its own thing. Tries to make its own story. You tell it to be more educational. But when it tries to be educational, but not educational about the right things, you call it whitewashing. There's no winning here. It finishes off saying games like other media may not be the best place to find historical fidelity, and they still have a long way to go before they can become an inclusive tool that they have the potential to be. Which is a half-truth. Games do have the potential to be great educational tools, but they don't have to be. And I think the way that this article is going is almost looking at as if every game should have that burden to be historically educational to every single person, saying that every title has to be as authentic to history as humanly possible, which just isn't the case. If that's not the intention of the developers, they shouldn't be beholden to those limitations. All in all, I think it's just another one of these out of touch articles that kind of have a good point but feel the need to put in some controversy towards the middle because of course it gets them more clicks, and well, I'm the epitome of that, as you can tell. But I'd really love to start a discussion on this. What do you guys think? Should Ghost of Tsushima be held to the same standard as Ubisoft's educational update for their game? I think it's completely ridiculous that that should even be brought into the same sentence, but I'd love to know what you guys think. So please leave a comment below. But leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, leave a dislike if you didn't. But until then, I will see you in the next one.